Everyone mocked the quiet spinster. The Duke asked her father for her hand that very night. Autumn came to the village of Ashcombe the way a bailiff comes to a small house, without knocking, and with an inventory in its hand. It stripped the elms along the lane. It set a slow gray hand on every windowpane in the parsonage, and on the plain gray windowpanes of the little manor at the end of the lane, and on the small round mullioned window of the room at the top of the stairs where Elinor Ashcombe sat with a mending basket on her knees, threading gray wool through gray wool, as though invisibility were a stitch one could learn. She was 27 that October. In the county book of daughters she was, by convention, past counting. There was a phrase for women in her position, in the drawing rooms of Ashcombe, and it was not spoken unkindly, only carelessly, which is a worse cruelty than unkindness because it is not even meant. The quiet Ashcombe girl. That was what they called her when they remembered to call her anything. Not Elinor. Not Miss Ashcombe. The quiet one. As though her name had been mislaid in a drawer. She had learned, over 3 seasons, that a woman could disappear inside her own name. That a woman could walk from the church to the market to the tea-table and back, and no eye in the village would light on her longer than an eye would light on a hedge. She had learned, further, that this disappearance was not a punishment. It was a habit the world had, and she had, in her way, made peace with it. Peace, she thought, was the poor cousin of contentment. But the poor cousin was still family, and she took what was offered. Downstairs, her father was drinking his tea alone in the little library and rereading, for the 3rd afternoon that week, the letter that had come by the post on Tuesday. Elinor could hear the paper crackle in his hand from where she sat 2 floors above him. Sir Henry Ashcombe was 60 and stooped and tired, and the estate that he had inherited from his elder brother 30 years ago was a small one, and the debts against it were not small, and the letter in his hand was, Elinor suspected, from London. She did not go down. She had, over the years, developed an instinct for when her father wished to be found and when he wished to be left, and this afternoon the paper was crackling in the wrong rhythm. She lowered her chin over her mending basket and threaded another length of gray wool. At the little mullioned window, the last of the October light moved slowly across the sill, the color of weak tea. A single crow settled on the elm beyond the gate and put its head to one side and considered the manor with an air of professional curiosity, as though even the birds of Ashcombe were assessing what remained of the house and what did not. Elinor's mother had died when Elinor was 15 and her younger sister Charlotte was 11, and after that the household had learned, without exactly deciding to, that Elinor would take up the small tasks the mistress of the house had left half-finished. The linen, the still room, the children of tenants who came to the back door with a cough, the accounts, when her father was too tired to read, the letters of condolence, when a neighbor died, the wedding sampler, when Charlotte at 19 had made a match Elinor herself had never been offered. Charlotte was married 2 years now to a curate in Kent with a fondness for green ribbon, and Charlotte still wrote every second Sunday, and the letters were kind and empty in the way that kind, empty letters are. There was a knock at the door of the little parlor. "Miss Elinor," said the maid, "your father sends his compliments and asks if you would come down to the library." Elinor set her mending aside. She touched the small dark oval mourning brooch at her throat, once absently. A small habitual gesture of hers, the way another woman might smooth her hair, and stood, and went down the narrow stairs, and did not think for one moment that the paper crackling in her father's hand had anything to do with her. She was wrong in a quiet, absolute way. The paper in her father's hand had everything to do with her. The autumn that had arrived at Ashcombe like a bailiff had brought, beneath its plain gray coat, a letter that would, before that same night was over, ask for her hand. But she did not know this yet, and neither, in truth, did her father, because although the letter had asked in writing to call, it had not said in writing why. She stepped into the library. Her father folded the letter and put it under his hand and looked up at her, and his tired gray eyes were tireder than usual. "Sit down, my dear," he said. "There is a matter I must speak with you about before the evening." She sat. She folded her hands, the right upon the left. Her father cleared his throat, and cleared it again, and the fire hissed in the grate, and outside a slow rain began to speak against the window with the soft, patient voice rain has when it means to stay. "The Duke of Ravenmere," her father said at last, "is passing through the county. He is a friend, well, not a friend exactly. I have some acquaintance with his late father. He has written to ask if he may call this evening. On business. Elinor said nothing. She had never met a duke. She had, in truth, never met anyone above the rank of a squire. The Duke of Ravenmere was, so far as she knew, an idea in a newspaper, an unmarried peer whose estate was somewhere in the north, and whose name had been half mentioned in one or two London gossip columns. Charlotte had once posted her, more out of a sister's habit than any thought that Elinor would care. On business, she repeated carefully. He is the estate, her father said. He has taken an interest in the Ashcombe rents. In the boundary at the eastern field. There is a legal matter. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the letter under his hand. He may wish also, I believe, to speak of the debt. Elinor understood, with a sudden, cold clarity, that her father was lying to her, and that he was lying not to hurt her but because he could not yet bear to tell her the truth. She had known him too long to mistake it. When Sir Henry lied, his eyes settled on the small brass paperweight on his desk, and stayed there. His eyes were on it now. She did not press. She had learned that too. At what hour does his grace call? She said. After dinner. At 8. Then I shall be in the drawing-room to receive him, if you wish. Her father looked up sharply at that. There was a small, unguarded flicker in his face. A kind of grief or surprise or both. And it was gone before she could name it. Yes, he said. Yes, Elinor. I should be grateful. Wear the gray. I shall wear the gray, she said. She stood, and dropped him the smallest curtsy, more of a habit than a ceremony, and went out. On the stairs she paused, one hand on the wooden banister, and let herself, for a single breath, feel the cold under her skin. Something was wrong. Something in the letter, or in her father's face. She did not know what. She had never known a duke to trouble himself with the boundary of an eastern field. By evening, the news of the duke's visit had already reached the parsonage, because such news reaches parsonages within an hour by mechanisms no one can quite name. By 6 it had reached the Marburys at the great house, the Marburys who had, in Charlotte's absence, more or less appointed themselves the arbiters of what remained of village society. And by 7 the Marburys' eldest daughter, Lady Catherine Marbury, had arrived on the doorstep of Ashcombe Manor unannounced, in a pale rose gown, with her fan already half raised, on the pretext of returning a book Elinor had, in fact, never lent her. My dear, said Lady Catherine, seating herself in the little drawing-room without waiting to be asked, and looking around at it with a small, tolerant smile, we hear you are entertaining royalty tonight. The Duke of Ravenmere, Elinor said, is not royalty. A duke, my dear, is close enough for Ashcombe. The fan rose a fraction. One does hope you have thought about your dress. I have, said Elinor, and did not elaborate. Lady Catherine turned the fan the other way. It is only that a man of that rank, you understand, of course, will notice such things. One does not wish him to think that Ashcombe cannot receive him properly. He is calling on my father, Elinor said, not on my dress. Oh, my dear. The fan closed with a small click. How very like you to think so. Lady Catherine stayed 12 minutes. She said nothing that was strictly unkind and everything that was cumulatively cruel, a small remark about spinsters who did not sit for portraits, a smaller one about the ribbon on Elinor's cuff, a smaller one still about the state of the hall carpet. Then she rose, kissed the air near Elinor's cheek, and swept out into the evening. Elinor stood in the little drawing-room after she had gone and looked at the hall carpet, and touched the mourning brooch at her throat, and felt, in that moment, invisible in her own house. At 3 minutes to 8, a carriage came up the lane. The Duke of Ravenmere was not what the county had imagined. Elinor had, without quite meaning to, imagined a stout older man with side whiskers, because that was the shape of the only duke she had ever seen in a print. The man who stepped down from the carriage was tall and dark-haired and no more than 34, and he took off his hat as he came up the steps as a man takes off his hat before a house he means to be careful of. He was shown into the library. Elinor was not present. She had, at her father's request, remained in the drawing-room. She sat with her hands folded and heard, through 2 closed doors and a hallway, the low, steady murmur of 2 men speaking. There was no raised voice. There was no anger. She could not make out a single word. He was in the library for 41 minutes. She counted, in half-conscious increments, by the small brass clock on the mantel. At 23 minutes past 8, the library door opened, and her father's step and the Duke's step came, together across the hall and stopped outside the drawing room. "Elinor," said her father, and his voice was careful in the way one is careful about a candle in a wind. "Come, my dear. His Grace wishes to speak with you." She stood. She crossed the room. She met the Duke's eyes for the first time and found them unexpectedly, not the eyes of a man taking inventory of a house, but the eyes of a man who had already, in some private ledger she could not see, taken his decision, and who was here now to make it plain. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, and bowed. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped a small, exact curtsy. Her father, at the door, did an extraordinary thing. He closed it behind him and left them alone. In 23 years, Elinor could not remember her father having done such a thing. It made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner, as though the closing of that door had let a small pressure out. "Miss Ashcombe," the Duke said, "I shall be direct, if I may. Directness is, I think, the least discourtesy I can offer you." "Please," said Elinor. "I have this evening asked your father for your hand. He has provisionally agreed. He has, on your behalf, asked me to speak with you before any announcement is made. I do not wish you to feel yourself required, in any way, by his answer. It is your answer I have come for." Elinor stood very still. The room was very still. The fire in the grate spoke, and only the fire. "Your Grace," she said, "at last you do not know me." "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "forgive me. I know you a little better than you suppose. I have, in fact, been at Ashcombe once before this year, though not in the character in which I stand now. But that is a longer story than can be told before your father returns to the room. May I have your answer?" She looked at him a long moment. "You may," she said, "have my consideration. Not tonight, my answer." He inclined his head. "Then I shall wait for your answer as long as it takes you to give it. I do not require it before I leave this house. I require only that you know that the offer stands." She thought about this, and touched, once, the mourning brooch at her throat. "Very well," she said. "The offer stands." She gave him her answer 9 days later, in a letter of 4 lines, in her own hand, sent under her father's seal to the inn at the crossroads where the Duke had said, on parting, he might be reached. The letter said, "Your Grace, I have considered your offer. I accept with such honesty as I have. I do not bring you a fortune. I bring you a name and a willingness. Elinor Ashcombe." She did not tell the parsonage. She did not tell the Marburys. She did not tell Charlotte in Kent. She told her father the morning she posted the letter, and her father, on hearing, wept, silently, one hand over his eyes, and Elinor did not weep. She had not, since her mother's death, wept where anyone could see. The bargain, she understood now, was a plain one. The Duke would pay her father's debts in full and settle a small annuity on Sir Henry for his life. In return, Elinor would become the Duchess of Ravenmere, and would be installed at the ducal estate in the north, and would be, in the county book of daughters, no longer past counting. There would be no long betrothal. There would be no London season. The wedding would be quiet and quick, and, the Duke had said it plainly in the library that evening, held in the small parish church at Ashcombe itself, so that her father, who was not strong enough for a long journey, might see her married. The wedding was set for the 18th of November. It was 23 days off. News, when it reached the village, did what news does in villages. It rose in a slow tide. The parsonage received it in polite astonishment. The Marburys received it in stunned silence, which was worse, and lasted a day, and turned by the second morning into a bright, brittle public congratulation that fooled no one. Lady Catherine Marbury called at Ashcombe twice, unannounced, and stayed too long each time, and asked, with her fan half over her mouth, questions Elinor did not answer. The wedding morning came in slow, cold, clean November light. The lane was frosted. The elms held nothing at all. Elinor dressed in her mother's plain gray silk gown, long-sleeved, high-necked, with a modest cream fichu at the throat, and did her own hair in a low chignon parted in the center, and put on the small dark oval mourning brooch at her throat, and no other jewel. She had refused the pearls the Duke had sent by carrier 2 evenings before. She had sent them back, in the same box, with a small, careful note. "Your Grace, I thank you. I shall wear on the day only what I have worn every day. Elinor. He had replied by the same carrier in a small hand, Miss Ashcombe, as you please. Ravenmere. The parish church at Ashcombe held 60. 90 came. Every pew was full and every aisle was standing and the door was open behind the last of them with the November cold coming in. Sir Henry walked her up the aisle at 11 o'clock, on the arm on which he had walked her mother 28 years before, and he was crying and he did not care, and Elinor did not cry. The Duke was standing at the altar in a plain dark coat and cream waistcoat and white cravat, and he turned when she reached the last pew, and their eyes met and he did not smile. He inclined his head, once, a small, careful, entirely private gesture, and Elinor understood, with a clarity she had not expected, that he had come to the church that morning as a man comes to a promise he means to keep. The service was 17 minutes long. There was no music. There was no procession afterward. There was a small breakfast in the manor, at which the Marburys attended and Lady Catherine ate nothing and said, in a small, bright voice, that the ceremony had been very touching, very simple, very much in the country style. And by 3 o'clock in the afternoon Elinor was in the ducal carriage, in her mother's grey silk cloak, beside a man whose signet ring she had watched him turn on his little finger 7 times during the wedding breakfast. The carriage went north. They traveled 2 days. The Duke, Julian, though she did not yet call him Julian, and he did not ask her to, sat opposite her in the carriage and read a small cloth-bound book. Once he asked, without looking up, whether she was warm enough, and she said she was. Once he asked whether she should like to stop at the next inn, and she said she should like to go on. Once, at the second dusk, he lifted his eyes from his book and looked at her a long moment, and she felt the look, though she did not return it, and after that neither of them spoke until they came, in the falling dark, over a low hill and saw Ravenmere Hall for the first time. Ravenmere was a large, grey, austere house of the middle of the last century, 3 stories, 20 windows to a front, a long low sweep of gravel, a small stone lion at each end of the balustrade. There were lights in only 4 of the 20 front windows. It looked, Elinor thought, exactly like a house that had never been asked to be warm. The housekeeper, Mrs. Beek, was waiting in the hall in a plain black wool dress and a starched white fichu, with a ring of keys on a chatelaine at her waist and a plain white linen cap on her silver hair. She curtsied to the Duke, and then, with an exactness that was not warmth but was something more considered than mere ceremony, she curtsied to Elinor. Your Grace, she said to him. Your Grace, she said to her. Elinor felt the name settle on her shoulders as a shawl settles. Not heavy, but present. She had, until that moment, been the quiet Ashcombe girl. She was now the Duchess of Ravenmere. It occurred to her that she had not yet found out what that meant. Mrs. Beek will show you to your rooms, the Duke said. You will forgive me, madam. I have letters to attend to that cannot wait. I shall dine in the library. If you wish to dine in your rooms, or in the great dining room, Mrs. Beek will arrange either. I bid you good night. He inclined his head. He was gone before she could speak. Elinor stood very still in the great, cold, echoing hall of her new house, and Mrs. Beek stood very still beside her, and there was, for a long moment, a silence in which Elinor could hear only the small brass tick of a clock on the far side of the hall. Your Grace, said Mrs. Beek at length quite gently, if you would come with me. Her rooms were on the first floor at the east end. A small sitting room, a bedchamber, a dressing room, a servant's room beyond. The furniture was new-looking at least, new-covered. The colors were pale rose and cream. A fire had been lit an hour before. The bed had been aired. A vase of small white winter chrysanthemums stood on the writing desk. Everything had been arranged, Elinor understood, by Mrs. Beek, on the instructions of the Duke, and everything had been arranged for a woman he had never once, in the whole of her 4 days of acquaintance with him, presumed to know. She dined that night in her rooms. She did not see him again for 2 days. The pattern set itself in that first fortnight without either of them naming it. The Duke rose early. The Duke was in his library, or on the estate, or at the stables, or with the steward, from before Elinor came down until well after the noon meal. The Duke dined in the library alone, or, on the 4th night, in the great dining room with her, a long dining table for 20, at which they sat one at each end, more than the length of a room between them, so that any word spoken had to be spoken loudly enough for the footman by the sideboard to hear. They spoke at that first dinner of the weather. They spoke of the roads. They spoke of the health of Sir Henry, of whom the Duke asked with a courteous exactness. They did not speak of the marriage. They did not speak of themselves. He was, Elinor thought, a man who had made a bargain and who meant to keep it, and who had not, yet, decided what more than the bargain he wished from her or she from him. She learned Ravenmere slowly. The library was his. The music room, which she did not play, sat closed. The morning room in the east wing was hers. The great drawing room downstairs was, in practice, no one's. It had been dust-sheeted since the last Duchess's death 7 years before. The still room was Mrs. Beek's. The kitchens were Mrs. Beek's. The gardens were the head gardener's. The stables were the Duke's. The great house, Elinor understood, had been run for 7 years by servants who had, in the absence of a mistress, made it into a place that did not require one. The staff were courteous. They were competent. They did not need her. She did not, at first, do very much. She wrote to her father twice a week, careful, honest letters. She wrote once, briefly, to Charlotte. She walked in the gardens in the morning, before the frost had lifted. She read in the morning room in the afternoon. She sat, in the evening, in the great dining room, at the far end of a long table, and made careful, polite conversation about the state of the roads with the man who had asked, one October evening, for her hand. She did not weep. She had trained herself out of weeping at 15, and she did not intend, at 27, to relearn. She did notice things. She noticed that the Duke turned his signet ring 7 times when he was thinking of something that troubled him, and once when he was thinking of something that pleased him. She noticed that he did not eat game, though it was set before him 3 times in the first week. She noticed that he read late. The light in the library window burned, at some nights, until 2. She noticed that he had, in a small silver frame on the mantel of the library, a portrait miniature of a woman with dark hair and gray eyes and a soft mouth. His mother, Mrs. Beek, said quietly, when Elinor asked on the 7th day. His mother had died when he was 11. She noticed, above all, that he was scrupulously, almost painfully, courteous with her. He rose when she entered a room. He waited at doors. He offered his arm on stairs. He never touched her hand except in the smallest gesture required by manners. He did not come near her rooms. He did not, at any moment in that first fortnight, ask anything of her. It was, Elinor thought, at the end of that fortnight, sitting alone at her writing desk with a letter to her father half finished and the small brass tick of a clock keeping time in the corner, a very cold house. Not a cruel one, not an unkind one, cold one. A house that had been arranged at great expense. For a woman it did not yet know how to receive. She folded the letter to her father. She sealed it. She sat a long time at the window, looking out at the December garden, the low box hedges beneath a thin white lace of frost, and felt, for the first time in a long time, something she had not expected to feel. She was curious. She was married to a man whose signet ring turned 7 times when he thought of something that troubled him, and once when he thought of something that pleased him. She did not yet know which she was. The days at Ravenmere were slow and long and shaped, above all, by the light. In December, at the far north end of the estate, the sun did not come over the low eastern hills until nearly 9, and it was gone again, in a thin cold gold at the tops of the elms by 4. Elinor learned the light. She learned which of the east wing windows caught the morning first, and which corner of the morning room held its warmth longest, and where in the long gallery on the 2nd floor the winter sun made, at 2:30, a single narrow parallelogram across the polished oak floor that a woman could sit within, on a plain wooden chair, and be warmed at her back for exactly 17 minutes. She learned the servants. Not their duties. Mrs. Beek had already ordered those with a precision Elinor did not intend to disturb, but the small individual textures of them. The under-housemaid, Hannah, was 17 and afraid of the great staircase in the dark. The 2nd footman, Peters, had a mother in the village who was ill and to whom he sent, by his own arrangement, 5 shillings of every quarter. The kitchen maid, Bess, had a small persistent cough that Elinor recognized at once from the tenants at Ashcombe, and Elinor, on the 6th day, sent Mrs. Beek to the still room for the honey and thyme her mother had taught her, and Bess coughed less by the second week. She learned, without asking, one more thing. Every evening at 10 o'clock, the light beneath the library door burned steady. She had passed the door twice on her way up to bed, in the first 10 days of her residence. On the third pass she stopped. She stood, for perhaps 20 seconds, at a small distance from the door, and heard, from within, the low, even sound of a man reading aloud, softly to himself, in a voice pitched to no one but the page. He was reading, she thought, a sermon, or a book of essays. He was reading not to be heard. He was reading, she understood suddenly, the way a person reads who has not, in some considerable time, had another voice in the room to read to. She did not knock. She went on up to her rooms. But she noted it, in the small honest ledger of things she was learning about her husband, and she added it, that night, to the ledger of things she had not yet decided what to do about. From his perspective, 200 miles from the parsonage where he had, one wet October evening, sat in a small library and asked a very tired man for a woman he had already quietly, in his own private ledger, chosen. From his perspective, the Duke of Ravenmere was a man who had made, at long last, a decision he had been circling for a year and a half. He had been at Ashcombe once before. He had never told her. He had, in April, come through the county on a private matter of estate business, a boundary dispute of his own with a neighboring landowner, which had required, absurdly, that he consult the Ashcombe parish maps because the two estates had, in the 17th century, shared a surveyor. He had stayed one night at the inn at the crossroads, and he had, on the Sunday morning, gone to the parish church at Ashcombe to hear the service, because he was in the habit, when traveling, of going to whatever church was nearest. He had, at the back of that little church, watched a woman come in alone at the second bell, in a plain grey dress and a small mourning brooch, and sit in the pew nearest the door and mend throughout the service, with a needle and a small piece of dark thread, the sleeve of an old man's coat in the pew in front of her. The old man was, he understood later, the sexton, whose wife had died 3 weeks before. The mending was so small, so quiet, so unshowy, that no one in the church had noticed but Julian, standing at the very back in the shadow of the door. He had asked, on the Sunday afternoon, of the innkeeper, who the quiet, grey-dressed woman in the last pew had been. The innkeeper had said absently, "Oh, the quiet Ashcombe girl. Sir Henry's eldest. Past counting, poor thing." Julian had gone north that Monday. He had not forgotten her. He had thought about her, in fact, more than he had thought about any woman in his life to that point, and the thinking had not been about her plain grey dress or her still hands or her small mourning brooch, though he had marked all three. The thinking had been about the sleeve of the sexton's coat. He had, in September, made his inquiries. He had learned of Sir Henry's debts. He had learned of the manor's precariousness. He had learned, further, from a discreet correspondent, that no offer had ever been made for her hand. He had, in October, written to Sir Henry, requesting the courtesy of a call on private business. He had come, that October evening, to Ashcombe with the intention of asking for her hand. He had come with the intention, further, of paying every one of her father's debts in full, and settling on the old man an annuity that would carry him through the remainder of a tired life, and marrying her in whatever church she wished, in whatever plain dress she wished, on whatever day she wished. He had come, that October evening, having not the slightest intention of telling her, or her father, why. He had known, on the road north to Ravenmere with her opposite him in the carriage, that he could not tell her yet. She would not believe him. She would think, from her own long-trained habit of invisibility, that a duke could not possibly have chosen her from watching her mend a sleeve. She would suppose, sensibly, that the offer had been made for some other reason, pity, convenience, an obscure debt of her father's she did not know of, and she would arrange her whole understanding of him around that supposition. He would not, if he told her too soon, be believed. He would, if he told her too soon, be misheard. He decided, therefore, to be patient. He decided to be, as far as he could manage, invisible himself, courteous, present, uninvasive, and to let her come to know him in a house that had been arranged at some considerable expense, for a woman she was, and not for a woman she was not. He had underestimated one thing. He had underestimated her. In the third week of Elinor's residence at Ravenmere Hall, the head footman, a Yorkshireman of 30 called Tomlin, cut his hand rather badly on a broken decanter while clearing the dining sideboard on the Wednesday evening. It was, so far as anyone could tell, no one's fault. The decanter had been cracked. Tomlin had not seen. The cut ran from the base of his thumb to the middle of his palm, and it bled a good deal, and the under-housemaid who had been nearest went white and stood useless. Elinor had been passing through the hall on her way to bed. She heard the shout. She turned and came into the dining room and saw and did not go white. "Sit him down, please," she said quite calmly to the under-housemaid. "In that chair. Fetch Mrs. Beek. Fetch, please, a clean linen towel from the sideboard drawer. Fetch cold water, not hot. Not hot, cold. And a candle." She had taken off her own fichu before she had finished speaking. She was in a plain long-sleeved grey day dress, with the modest cream fichu at her throat, and she took the fichu off and folded it twice, longwise, and pressed it, hard and steady, against Tomlin's palm above the cut. She held it there without releasing pressure while Mrs. Beek was fetched. When Mrs. Beek came, Elinor said, without looking up, "Have you a still-room cupboard for these? A jar of yarrow powdered, if there is any. Any clean linen you have laid by. And send, if you would, for the surgeon at Ravenholme village. Only the surgeon, not the doctor from the town. The village surgeon will be quicker, and this needs stitching before it needs a physician." Mrs. Beek, who was 62 and had run Ravenmere Hall for 31 years and had, in all 31, never once been given so exact and so unhurried an order by any duchess of the house, went to fetch what had been asked for without a word. The Duke came into the dining room 7 minutes later. He had heard, from the library, the movement in the hall. He had come, in shirt-sleeves and waistcoat, without his coat. He stopped in the doorway. Elinor was on one knee beside the footman's chair, still holding the folded fichu against the man's palm, and the fichu was red now, from the fingers to the wrist, and Elinor's own left hand was steady on the man's forearm, and she was, in a low, calm voice, telling the footman about the elms at Ashcombe, and the crow that sat on the gate in October, and the small brass paperweight on her father's desk. Talking evenly, without stopping, about small, harmless, entirely ordinary things, so that the footman, who was frightened and losing color, would have a voice to fasten his mind to that was not the voice of his own fear. The Duke did not move for perhaps 10 seconds. His hand was on the door frame, and his knuckles were white against the wood. Then he came into the room, quietly, and said, "Mrs. Beek, the surgeon from Ravenholme. Now, my own horse if the trap is not harnessed." "Already sent for, your grace," said Mrs. Beek. He looked at Mrs. Beek. Mrs. Beek looked back at him steadily and said, with a very small, very careful inflection that carried, in its economy, an entire recommendation, "Her Grace sent, sir." The Duke turned his eyes to Elinor. He did not speak. Elinor did not look up. She was still talking to Tomlin, in a low, steady voice, about the elms at Ashcombe. She said, without breaking rhythm, "Your Grace, would you send a boy to the kitchen for a cup of sweetened tea? A boy will run faster than a footman." He said, "Yes." He sent the boy himself. The surgeon came in 23 minutes and stitched the hand at the sideboard, and Elinor stayed beside Tomlin the whole of that quarter hour, still holding the man's forearm, still talking low and even. When the surgeon was done and Tomlin was drinking sweetened tea in the servants' hall with Mrs. Beek beside him, Elinor rose and washed her hands at the small basin in the corner of the dining room. The fichu she left in the fire. Her hands were shaking. Once she had washed them, in a small, private, well-managed way she did not intend anyone to see. The Duke saw. He stood a little way behind her, in the doorway of the dining room, and he watched her hands shake in the small, even way they did, and he understood, for the first time in her presence, that his wife had done what she had just done not because she was without feeling but because she had trained herself out of showing it, at some considerable cost over some considerable time, for reasons that had nothing to do with him. He did not go to her. He knew, with a steadiness of understanding that surprised him, that if he touched her hand at that moment, she would not be able to bear it, and that he did not want the first time he touched her hand to be a moment she would remember as a moment she had not been able to bear. He said only, quite quietly, "Madam, I am obliged to you. I do not know how you knew what to do." Elinor said, without turning, "My mother taught me. Before she died. She was very good at these things." "I am obliged to your mother," the Duke said as well. She looked up, then. She met his eyes across the small space of the dining room. He inclined his head once, small, exact. The same inclination he had given her at the church at Ashcombe, when she had come up the aisle in the plain grey silk gown. She understood, in that moment, without knowing yet why she understood, that whatever he had come to Ashcombe for that October evening, it had not been the eastern boundary field. It was Mrs. Beek, in the end, who made the small change. Mrs. Beek had, in 31 years at Ravenmere, learned to observe with an exactness that was invisible to nearly everyone in the house. She had observed, in the fortnight after the footman's hand, that his Grace had begun to come out of the library at a different hour. He came out now at 4 o'clock, the hour at which her Grace, on all but the coldest days, walked in the frosted gardens for exactly 40 minutes. He did not walk with her Grace. He walked, instead, 20 yards behind her, along the parallel path on the other side of the long box hedge, a path from which he could, if he chose, watch her. A path from which she could not, without looking for him, know he was there. She had 3 times looked for him. Mrs. Beek had noted this also. Mrs. Beek had further observed that his Grace, at dinner in the great dining room, had begun to keep the newspaper folded rather than open. That he no longer, at the sideboard, sent the footman for a second glass of the claret. That he asked, at dinner on the Tuesday, whether her Grace preferred the mutton or the fowl, and asked it in a tone of such careful, unpracticed gentleness that Mrs. Beek, standing by the doorway with the wine, had had to look very fixedly at the pattern on the carpet. And Mrs. Beek had observed, above all, that the great long dining table for 20, at which the Duke and his new Duchess sat one at each end at the length of a whole room, made it impossible for them to speak to one another without shouting, and that they were both, in her observation, people who did not shout. She made her decision on the Thursday. She had, in the small unused breakfast room in the east wing, a room the last Duchess had used for private breakfasts and which had been closed and dust-sheeted since, a small round mahogany table of no great pedigree that would seat 4 at close quarters and 2 very comfortably. She had it uncovered on the Thursday morning. She had it polished. She had it moved, in the afternoon, by 2 of the footmen, into the great dining room. She had the long dining table for 20 covered at its center with a plain white linen cloth, and she had the small round mahogany table set at the fireside end of the room, with 2 chairs, near enough to the fire that a person seated at either could feel it, and set for 2, plainly, without candelabra, with only 2 small silver candlesticks and the ordinary house napkins. She said nothing to either of them. She placed herself, at 7 o'clock, in her usual station by the sideboard, and waited to see what would happen. The Duke came into the room at 3 minutes past 7. He stopped, one hand still on the door. He looked at the small round table by the fire. He looked at Mrs. Beek. Mrs. Beek looked back at him, quite steadily, with the same very careful inflection with which she had said, 3 weeks before, "Her Grace sent, sir." The Duke said, after a moment, "Mrs. Beek, this is a change." "Yes, your Grace." "Was it arranged?" "By me, sir. It seemed to me that the room might be warmer in the evenings." He looked at her a long moment. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Beek." Elinor came into the room at 7 minutes past 7. In a plain long-sleeved dark blue evening gown with a high modest neckline and no jewelry but the small mourning brooch. She saw the small round table by the fire. She saw the 2 chairs. She saw the Duke standing at the fire, not sitting, standing, waiting for her. She did not stop. She did not color. She did not remark. She walked, in her still, unhurried way, across the room to the fire, and stood on the other side of the small round table. He drew out her chair. She sat. He sat. The footman brought soup. Mrs. Beek, at the sideboard, did not look at either of them. They were, for the first time in the entirety of Elinor's residence at Ravenmere Hall, close enough to each other to speak in an ordinary voice. Close enough that she could see, without straining, the small pale scar above his left brow. Close enough that he could see, without straining, the way her fingers, when she was thinking of what to say, moved once, absently, to the small mourning brooch at her throat. He said, "Madam, I hope the change of arrangement is not disagreeable to you." She said, "No, your Grace. It is considerate." There was a small silence, in which the fire spoke and only the fire. He said, "May I ask you a question that I have wished to ask you these 3 weeks?" "You may." "Your mother, you said she taught you. Would you tell me a little of her?" Elinor set down her spoon. She looked at him a long moment across the small round table. She said quietly, "She was a plain woman, your grace. Very quiet. Very ordinary. She kept a still-room cupboard, and she went to the tenants' cottages when the children were ill, and she read prayers in the parish church on Wednesdays when the vicar was too tired to come. She was not celebrated. She was not remarked upon. When she died, 4 of the tenants' children came to the funeral and stood at the back and cried. And I have thought since that this was the truer measure of her, and that the rest of what the county said and did not say was the less true one." The Duke set down his own spoon. He said, "Madam, that is exactly what I have thought about my own mother." They spoke that evening for the first time of their mothers. They spoke, further, of the elms at Ashcombe, and the small brass paperweight on Sir Henry's desk, and the crow at the gate in October. They spoke of a book he had been reading in the library that week, a book by a clergyman in Norfolk on the winter migration of birds, and Elinor asked with unaffected interest 3 questions about it, and the Duke, who had not been asked 3 questions about a book by anyone in 8 years, answered them fully and asked her, at the end of his answering, whether she should like to read the book after him. She said she should. He said he would put it in the morning room in the east wing on the Sunday. Mrs. Beek, at the sideboard, at a certain point in the evening, arranged very small, very quietly, a fold in the napkin she was holding, in a manner that had nothing to do with the napkin. They ate slowly. The soup gave way to a plain roasted fowl in a pale broth with winter root vegetables, and after the fowl a small dish of stewed pears with a spoonful of cream, and after the pears a very small glass of a pale amber wine Julian had chosen himself from the cellar earlier in the day, a choice he did not remark upon, but which Elinor, in the small careful ledger of things she was learning about him, noted at once. He had not, in 6 weeks, opened a bottle he had chosen himself in her presence. He had, this evening, opened one. Between the fowl and the pears he asked her, quite plainly, how she should like the morning room in the east wing arranged. He said it not as a question of decoration but as a question of use. Elinor set down her fork and thought a moment and said that she should like a small writing desk moved to the window nearest the garden, and a shelf of the household ledgers moved into the drawer beneath it, and, if he did not mind, the small footstool from the library, which was worn but which she had grown fond of, for reading by the fire in the afternoon. He said, without hesitation, that everything she had named would be done in the morning. He said further that if there was any book in the library she should like to keep in her own morning room, she was to take it, and to keep it there for as long as she wished, and that he did not require, on any account, to be asked. She said quietly, "Your Grace, that is generous." He said, "Madam, it is not. It is only reasonable. This house is yours." When Elinor rose at 10, and said her good night and went to her rooms, the Duke stood at the fire a long time after she had gone. He stood with one hand on the mantel, turning his signet ring, once on his little finger. Only once, not 7 times. He turned it once and stopped, and looked at the small round table, and at the 2 chairs, and at the fire, and did not think of anything much except that his wife had, 3 weeks before, held a folded fichu against a man's cut hand and talked, in a low and even voice, about the elms at Ashcombe, and that she had, this evening, spoken across a small round table in an ordinary voice of her mother, and that these 2 things had been, in some way he could not yet have named, the same thing. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. In the 4th week of December, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmere, Julian's Aunt Beatrice, came to the hall for the Christmas fortnight. She was 71 years old, small and neat, with pure white hair drawn severely back, sharp black eyes, and a habit of asking questions no one else in a room had the courage to ask. She was Julian's father's youngest sister, and she had, since Julian's mother's death, been the only woman in his life to whom he answered without hesitation. She arrived on the Monday, in a black wool traveling cloak with a high modest neckline and long sleeves, in a plain long-sleeved dark plum day gown beneath it, and she took Elinor's hands in her own in the great hall before she had taken off her cloak. "So," said the Dowager with a small, exact, unsmiling appraisal, You are the young woman my nephew has spent a year and a half not writing to me about." "Ma'am," said Elinor, and curtsied. "Elinor," said the dowager. "I shall call you Elinor, if I may. My nephew, I have no doubt, has spent these 6 weeks calling you nothing but madam. He was raised, at 11, by a father who could not bring himself to say a woman's name aloud after the boy's mother died. I have spent 60 years correcting for it. Sit with me at dinner. Sit at his elbow. You are his wife, not his tenant." Elinor, who had not known, until that moment, that she had been waiting for anyone to say such a thing aloud, said only "Ma'am, yes." The dowager, over the fortnight of her visit, did for small, exact, unshowy things. She sat with Elinor in the morning room in the East Wing on the Wednesday morning and asked her, without preamble, 3 questions about her mother. She listened to Elinor's answers with her sharp black eyes fixed on Elinor's face and her small dry hands folded in her lap, and at the end of the 3rd answer she said, "Your mother was a woman I should have wished to know. My nephew has told me nothing of you, but he has told me, indirectly, that he watched you mend the sexton's sleeve. That, my dear, is not nothing. That, in my nephew, is a great deal," she said on the Friday in the corridor outside the library to Julian himself, in a voice that carried to Elinor in the morning room 3 doors along. "Nephew, you married a woman who does not know why you married her. That is your fault, not hers. Tend to it. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but before the season. She deserves the telling, and she deserves it from you," she said on the Sunday at church in the small parish chapel on the estate. Sitting at Elinor's elbow in a pew where the last duchess had once sat. "The parishioners are looking at you, my dear, in the way parishioners look at any woman who has come new into a great house. They will look and they will judge and they will be, at first, uncertain. You will not correct them. You will simply be what you are, week upon week, and in a year they will forget they were ever uncertain. This is not a strategy. This is only how it is done," she said on the last morning of her visit at the carriage, taking Elinor's hands again in her own. "You will be at the season in April, Elinor. You will come to London for the Ravenmere ball. You will wear whatever you please. Do not let anyone dress you against your own preference. And on the night of the ball you will stand, if you can manage it, near a pillar in a corner that is not the corner where they expect a duchess to stand. It will unsettle them. That, my dear, is your advantage. Use it once and then, mercifully, never again." She looked, then, at Julian standing on the gravel beside them with his hat in his hand. "Julian," she said, "she is worth what you have not yet told her. Tell her, when she is ready. Not before." She was gone by noon. Elinor stood at the tall east window of her sitting room a long time after the carriage had left, and touched the small mourning brooch at her throat once, and understood, without quite deciding to, that she was no longer entirely alone at Ravenmere Hall. They went to London for the season on the 3rd week of April. Julian would have preferred to remain at Ravenmere. Elinor understood this without his saying it. He turned his signet ring, at breakfast on the morning they were to leave, exactly 7 times. The town house in Grosvenor Square had been closed for 8 years and was opened for them at the end of March. It was a tall, pale, correct London house, with a black railing and a black door and a small brass plate on the door reading only Ravenmere. Elinor stood on the pavement the first evening, in a plain long-sleeved dark blue traveling gown, and looked up at the front of it, and thought that it looked exactly like a house that had been arranged, at long distance, by a housekeeper who had never been consulted about a duchess. Mrs. Beek had not come to London. Mrs. Beek had said, "At the last, Your Grace, I am a country woman and I shall be a country woman. London does not want me. The London housekeeper is a very sensible young woman of 40. You may trust her. I shall be here when you come back." Elinor had, absurdly, wished to weep at that, and did not. The London housekeeper was, as Mrs. Beek had said, a very sensible young woman of 40. Her name was Mrs. Hale. Elinor liked her at once. The season began, as all seasons began, with a slow tide of cards. Cards from names Elinor had never seen. Cards from names Julian had known all his life. Cards, on the 2nd Thursday, from Lord and Lady Marbury, who had come up to London for the season with their eldest daughter, Lady Catherine. And it was here, on that 2nd Thursday, that Elinor understood, in a small cold clarity, that the Marburys had followed her to London. That Lady Catherine, whose engagement had not, in the 6 months since Elinor's wedding, been announced, had come to London this season with a very particular intention. Julian did not know Lady Catherine. Elinor did not tell him. She said only, when he asked her, on the Friday morning, whether there was any name among the cards that troubled her. Not troubled, your grace. There is a young lady from my county, a Lady Catherine Marbury, who was, I think, disappointed by our marriage. I do not know that she will trouble us. But she will be at the balls. Julian looked at her a long moment across the breakfast table. He said, Madam, I shall watch for her. The Ravenmere ball had been fixed for the 22nd of May. It was, by long custom of the house, the third ball of the London season, and it was held, always, in the great ballroom of the Grosvenor Square house, a room 90 feet long with 3 chandeliers and a small orchestra gallery at the north end. It had not been held for 8 years. The dust sheets had been off since the 1st of April. Every duchess in London had already accepted. Elinor's dressmaker, Mrs. Hale's recommendation, a very small, very quiet woman in a very small, very quiet shop in a mews behind Bond Street, had made her, at Elinor's specific request, a single gown for the evening. It was a floor-length silk in a color the dressmaker had, at first, tried gently to talk Elinor out of. A plain, quiet, unshowy blue-gray, the exact color of the sky at 4 in the afternoon in November. The sleeves were long. The neckline was high and modest, covering the collarbone. There was no lace at the throat. There was no embroidery at the hem. The only ornament was a very narrow silver ribbon at the high waist, and a small hair ornament of 3 pale winter chrysanthemums, dried at the low chignon. The dressmaker, when the gown was finished, had said, quite softly, Your Grace, forgive me. Every woman at the ball will be in white or in rose or in pale gold. You will be the only woman in the room in this color. Are you certain? Elinor had said, That is what I am certain of. She had stood, that afternoon, in the small quiet mews shop, and let the dressmaker walk once around her with a pincushion in her hand and a careful measuring eye, and had thought, without saying it aloud, that the whole of the ballrooms of London had been arranged, for 100 years, on a single quiet assumption, that a woman who came into such a room must dress to compete with the other women in it. She had thought, further, that the assumption was, at its root, a mistake. She had thought that the only quiet advantage a woman in her position could hold was the advantage of refusing the competition, of standing, plainly, in the color of an unshowy November sky, and letting the room, if it wished, arrange its own opinion of her without her assistance. She had thought this without vanity and without spite. She had thought it only because she had, over 27 years, watched a great many women arrange themselves for the eyes of others, and she had, by now, decided that she did not intend to be one of them. The dressmaker, seeing something of this in Elinor's face, had said only, quite softly, Your Grace, yes. I shall make it in the blue-gray. The night of the ball, the Marburys arrived at 10. Lady Catherine was in a floor-length white silk gown with pearl trim at the modestly high neckline, a matching pearl coronet in her elaborately curled pale blonde hair, a full pearl necklace over the covered high collarbone, and pearl bracelets over her long white gloves. She was, by any measure that had ever been used in the drawing-rooms of Ashcombe, the most beautiful young woman in the room. She had, by her side, her mother and her father, and this was the first Elinor saw of it, a young man Elinor recognized from Ashcombe as the Marbury's second cousin, a barrister of 32 named Mr. Cranmer, who had once, 4 years before, called at Ashcombe and left, at the end of the call, without asking any question of Elinor. Mr. Cranmer had, Elinor noticed at once, small leather portfolio under his arm which he did not put down at the door. She noticed this. She did not remark upon it. She was, that evening, the Duchess of Ravenmere in her own house. She stood, at the receiving of the guests, at Julian's elbow. She curtsied. She spoke quietly and with unhurried courtesy, to each name as it was announced. She did not, at any moment, glance toward Lady Catherine in the far corner where she had, at Elinor's second turn away, taken up her station. At 10:30, when the last of the guests had been received, Julian offered her his arm. He said, at her ear, in a voice pitched only for her, Madame, the first set of the evening is customarily opened by the host and hostess. Would you do me the honor? She said, Your Grace, I have not danced in 9 years. He said, Nor have I. They opened the first set. They danced at slow country dance pace, the plainest and quietest of the figures. She did not look at him except at the turning of the figures. He did not look at her except at the turning of the figures. But at the last turn of the last figure, at the moment when a country dance requires the partners to face each other for one held beat before the music resolves, he looked at her and did not look away, and she saw in that held beat that he was smiling. A small, unpracticed, entirely private smile she had not seen on him in 7 months of marriage. She smiled back. It was, so far as anyone in the ballroom could remember, the first time the new Duchess of Ravenmere had smiled at anyone in a London ballroom. 3 chandeliers away, Lady Catherine Marbury raised her fan half over her mouth. By 11, Lady Catherine had approached. By 11:30, she had, with an unpracticed bright cruelty, said in a small carrying voice to the Countess of Lyford, "It is the most extraordinary thing, the country style. A woman of no fortune, no beauty, no connections, and a duke asks her hand in an hour. One does not know, my dear, whether to admire the duke's kindness or to pity his taste." The Countess of Lyford, who was 73 and had known 5 Duchesses of Ravenmere in her life, said only, "One does not, my dear, always know." At 11:45, Mr. Cranmer went to the small refreshment room at the north end of the ballroom, took the leather portfolio from under his arm, and laid on the small side table a single sheet of paper. Lady Catherine went to the refreshment room 3 minutes later, took up the sheet, looked at it, folded it once, and slipped it into the reticule at her wrist. Elinor, at the far end of the ballroom, in her plain blue-gray silk, noticed all 3 movements. She noticed them without turning her head. She had, at Ashcombe, spent 27 years watching a village from the corner of a room. She was very good at watching without turning her head. She said quite quietly at Julian's ear, "Your Grace, in a little while I think Lady Catherine will ask to speak in the smaller drawing-room. She has, I believe, a paper in her reticule that she means to produce. I do not know what it is, but she means to produce it, and she means to produce it in company." Julian, who had not, that evening, taken his eyes from his wife's face for more than 3 consecutive minutes, said only, "Madam, thank you. I shall be ready." At 12:10, Lady Catherine Marbury crossed the ballroom on her father's arm, and asked, in a small carrying voice, whether the Duke of Ravenmere might spare her a moment in the small drawing-room on a matter, she said it lightly, of some little delicacy, concerning the honor of the house. Julian looked at Elinor. Elinor looked at Julian. She said quite quietly, "Together." He said yes. They went in together. The small drawing-room at the north end of the townhouse was a room of pale green silk walls and 1 long low window on Grosvenor Square. There were 14 people in it by the time Julian and Elinor entered. A very careful selection Lady Catherine had been shepherding, since 10:30, one by one, on quiet pretexts. The Countess of Lyford, the Earl and Countess of Whitcomb, the Dowager Marchioness of Selby, 2 of Julian's oldest friends from his London club, 3 of the season's most senior hostesses, Lord and Lady Marbury, Mr. Cranmer, with his portfolio now open on the small round table by the window, and, at the fire, Lady Catherine herself in her white silk and her pearls. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenmere, who had come up from her bath house for the ball, was seated in the largest armchair. She did not rise. Her small dry hands were folded in her lap. Her sharp black eyes were on Lady Catherine. Lady Catherine curtsied to Julian. She curtsied, less deeply, to Elinor. "Your Grace," she said to Julian, "forgive me. I would not have troubled you on the evening of your own ball had the matter not seemed to me, and to Mr. Cranmer, who is my family's man of law, one which touches on the honor of your house, and which, in a family of your standing, ought not to be allowed to circulate without your knowledge." Julian said, quite calmly, "Speak." Lady Catherine turned, once, to the portfolio on the small round table. Mr. Cranmer, with the practiced smoothness of a barrister who has performed such gestures before, lifted from the portfolio a single sheet of paper, and held it out, not to Julian but half to the room, so that every eye in the pale green drawing-room could see that a paper had been produced. "Your Grace," said Lady Catherine, "it grieves me to say it. Indeed, I have hesitated all evening. But Mr. Cranmer has in his possession a promissory note, signed by Sir Henry Ashcombe of Ashcombe Manor, drawn in favour of my late uncle Sir Percival Marbury in the sum of £3,200, dated the 15th of September of last year. It is, I am informed, currently unpaid. It is, further, the property of my father as executor of my uncle's estate. And it was not, I must say this with regret, it was not, so far as any of the parties present can determine, disclosed to your grace at the time of your marriage. The pale green drawing-room went very still. Elinor did not move. She had known, on the ride north to Ravenmere in November, that her father had told her the truth about the debts as far as he understood them, and that there had been letters in the last months of the previous year that he had put under his hand on the desk. She had not known of a Marbury note. It was, she understood in one clean cold instant, very likely genuine. Her father was a tired man of 60 who had, in his tiredness, borrowed where he ought not to have borrowed, and had, in his shame, not spoken of it. She did not look at her husband. She did not need to look at her husband. She had held a folded fichu, in December, against a footman's cut palm, and she had learned at 15 not to weep in front of anyone. She was, at that moment, the calmest person in the pale green drawing-room. Lady Catherine's fan rose a fraction. It is our understanding, she went on, that Sir Henry Ashcombe's estate was, at the time of Miss Ashcombe's marriage, less solvent than had been represented. It is, further, our concern that the house of Ravenmere may have entered upon its alliance with the Ashcombes on a partial view of the facts. We do not, of course, presume to speak to the wisdom of your grace's choice. We speak only to the honor of the house, and we felt it must be brought, before the smallest company that could hear it, to your grace's notice. She had done it very well. Elinor gave her, privately, the credit. Lady Catherine had not accused Elinor of concealment. Lady Catherine had accused Sir Henry, a tired old man in Ashcombe, 200 miles away, who could not defend himself, and had, in the accusation, placed the house of Ravenmere in the position of the deceived party, and Elinor in the position of the smiling collaborator. It was, so far as such things went, an elegant piece of work. Julian said nothing for a long moment. Then he did something no one in the pale green drawing-room had expected. He turned, not to Lady Catherine, and not to Mr. Cranmer, and not to the portfolio on the small round table. He turned to Elinor. He said, in a voice pitched exactly loudly enough for the 14 people in the room to hear, Madam, did you know of this note? Elinor said, without hesitation, without dropping her eyes, I did not, your grace. My father did not tell me. I do not believe, on my honor, that he told anyone. Julian said, I believe you. He said it plainly, at ordinary conversational volume, and it was the plainness of it that made it, in that room, unanswerable. He said it not as a husband defending a wife, but as one honest person confirming another honest person on a point of fact. He turned then, at last, to Mr. Cranmer. Mr. Cranmer, he said, I know the note. I paid it in November. Mr. Cranmer, whose face was a face trained by the profession to give away nothing, gave away, in that instant, a small, involuntary blink. Your Grace, I paid it, Julian said, on the 12th of November, 6 days before my wedding, through my London banker, into the account of the executor of the late Sir Percival Marbury's estate. If the executor's records do not reflect it, that is a matter for the executor's clerk, not for Sir Henry Ashcombe. If the note itself has not been marked paid and returned, that is a further matter for the executor's clerk. I shall be at Coutts on Monday at 10. I shall bring with me the receipt of the transfer. Lord Marbury, he inclined his head, a small exact gesture, to Lady Catherine's father across the room. I shall welcome your presence, or your solicitors, at any hour convenient to you. The matter will be resolved by the close of business on Monday, and the note will be marked paid, and returned to your family. There was a silence in the pale green drawing-room in which one could hear, faintly, from the ballroom beyond, the small orchestra beginning the 6th set of the evening. Julian was not finished. But that, he said, is the small part of what needs saying in this room this evening. He turned back to Elinor. He did not offer her his arm. He did not take her hand. He stood beside her at his ordinary distance, and he spoke, not to her but past her, to the 14 people in the pale green drawing-room, in the low, even voice of a man who had, for some time now, been preparing what he was about to say. "Lady Catherine," he said, "you have said, this evening, that the House of Ravenmere may have entered upon its alliance on a partial view of the facts. Permit me to correct the record. I chose my wife," he said, "not for a dowry. There was none. I paid her father's debts before the wedding, in full, from my own purse, and I would have paid them had she said no to me on that October evening in the drawing-room of her father's house. I chose her not for a fortune, and not for a connection, and not for a name my mother would have recognized, though God knows my mother, had she lived, would have recognized her at the first sight of her. I chose her not for her presentation, because she has never been presented. I chose her not for beauty as the ballrooms of London name beauty. Though there is not a woman in this room I would rather look at across a small round table by a fire. I chose her not for what she brought, because she brought only herself, and I have thought, this 7 months past, that only herself has been more than any dowry in the county book of daughters could ever have named. I chose her," he said, and here he did the thing the whole room, without knowing it, had been waiting for. The thing had been waiting for. He chose her for something specific. "I chose her because on a Sunday in April, in the back of a country church at Ashcombe, I watched her mend the sleeve of a sexton whose wife had died 3 weeks before. She did not know I was there. She did not know I was watching. She did not know I was anyone at all. She mended his sleeve because his sleeve was torn, and because he was tired, and because she was the sort of person who mends a tired man's sleeve without being asked. That, in this room and in this life, is the whole of my answer." He looked, then, at Lady Catherine. "I chose her," he said quietly, "because you would not have chosen her. And because that, madam, is the beginning of the difference between us." The pale green drawing-room did not stir. Lady Catherine's fan, which had been half raised at the beginning of Julian's speech, was now closed in her hand. Her fingers, on the ivory of it, were white. The Countess of Lyford, 73 years old and unimpressed with duchesses since the reign of George III, said, in the plain flat voice with which she had spoken to 5 duchesses of Ravenmere in her lifetime, "Your Grace has spoken very properly. I should like, if I may, to escort her Grace back to the ballroom on my arm. It seems to me the room has been away from its hostess long enough." She rose. She was small and stooped and immensely dignified. She held out her arm. Elinor took it. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenmere, from her armchair, said, without moving, "Yes. Take her back to the ballroom, Amelia. And Lady Catherine, you will remain, I think, a moment longer. My nephew is not, I believe, quite finished speaking." The door of the small drawing-room closed behind Elinor and the Countess of Lyford. What Julian said to Lady Catherine and Mr. Cranmer, and what the Dowager Duchess said after him, no one in the ballroom would learn that night. It was said quietly, exactly, with a barrister's precision as to the promissory note and a duke's precision as to a young woman's public standing. When Mr. Cranmer emerged at 1:15, he emerged with the portfolio closed and with an expression which those who knew barristers well understood to be, for a barrister, considerable. Lady Catherine emerged with her mother on one side and her father on the other. She emerged very pale and very upright and very silent, and she did not, that evening, speak again to any person in the room. The Marburys left the ball without a farewell at 1. Elinor, in the ballroom, on the arm of the Countess of Lyford, was returned to a room that had heard nothing of the pale green drawing-room and knew only that the Duke of Ravenmere had, quite unusually, been absent from his own ball for a quarter of an hour, and that his Duchess, in her plain blue-grey silk, had been walked back to the middle of the room by the Countess of Lyford, whose approval had not been visibly extended to any newcomer to London society in 15 years. The Countess of Lyford, at the door of the ballroom, released Elinor's arm. She said, quite crisply, at ordinary conversational volume, so that everyone within 12 feet of her heard it, "Your Grace, I shall call on you at Grosvenor Square on Tuesday morning at 11. I bring always my own tea. I do not take milk. I bring, further, a great deal of gossip you will not otherwise hear, and one useful piece of advice per visit, whether you require it or not. Good evening." She curtsied. It was a very small, very exact curtsy. It was the first time the Countess of Lyford had curtsied, in a London ballroom, to a woman less than 50. The ballroom noticed. Julian returned to the ballroom at 10 minutes past 1. He came directly to Elinor. He said at her ear only, "Madam, the 6th set is nearly finished. Would you dance the 7th with me?" She said, "I would." They danced the 7th. It was a slower set, a set at which conversation between partners was possible without shouting. Julian said, "At the first turn, madam, there is one more thing I must say to you tonight. Cannot be said in the ballroom. Would you walk with me after the set to the small library on the first floor?" She said, "Yes." The small library on the first floor of the Grosvenor Square house was a warm, dark-paneled room with a low fire, one wall of books, 2 chairs by the hearth, and no candles but the 2 on the mantel. He drew out a chair for her. She sat. He did not sit. He stood at the fire. He said, "Madam, I have owed you, since November, a piece of information about the origin of our marriage. I have not told you because I did not think you would believe me. I do not now think that is my judgment to make." He turned once the signet ring on his little finger. Only once. He said, "I chose you, Elinor, not for the reasons the ballrooms of London imagine. I chose you not for beauty as the ballrooms of London name beauty, though I have found, this 7 months past, that there is not a face in any ballroom I would rather look at across a small round table by a fire. I chose you not for a fortune because I have my own, and did not require one, and did not want the confusion of one. I chose you not for a connection, because I have every connection in this room and none of them has done more than tire me. I chose you not for a name my mother would have recognized, though God knows my mother would have recognized you. I chose you not for what you brought, because you brought only yourself. I chose you, Elinor," he said quietly, "because on a Sunday in April, in the back of a country church at Ashcombe, I watched you mend the sleeve of a sexton whose wife had died 3 weeks before. I was standing at the back of the church in the shadow of the door. You did not see me. You did not know a stranger was in the church at all. You mended his sleeve in the whole of the service with a needle and a small piece of dark thread, because his sleeve was torn, and because he was tired, and because you were the sort of person who mends a tired man's sleeve without being asked. And I have thought, ever since that Sunday, that I would rather be the man across a small round table from a woman like that than the husband of any woman in London." He paused. He said very quietly, "You were seen, Elinor, even when you thought you were invisible. You were seen on that Sunday in April. You were seen at the wedding at Ashcombe in the plain grey silk of your mother's. You were seen at the sideboard in December with a folded fichu against a footman's hand. You were seen at the small round table by the fire, speaking of your mother. You were seen at the Eastern walk in the mornings before the frost had lifted. You were seen at the parish church at Ravenholme on Sunday mornings, sitting at Mrs. Beek's elbow in the pew nearest the door. You were seen at the door of the tenants' cottages when the children were ill. You were seen every day since. You have not, in all your life, been unseen. You have only been overlooked by eyes that were not worth looking back at." He paused, once, and drew, quietly, a breath. "You have been seen by me, Elinor," he said, "every day since April, and you will be seen by me every day for the rest of my life." Elinor sat very still in the small dark-paneled library. Her hands were folded in her lap. She did not touch the mourning brooch at her throat. She had, in 27 years of practiced invisibility, never once been told, plainly, that she had been seen. She said, at last, in a very small, very level voice, "Your Grace, Julian." He said, "Yes." She said, You have said it exactly." He said, "I have said it late." She said, "You have said it in time." They did not touch. He did not offer his hand. She did not offer hers. They looked at each other across the small warm room, in the low light of 2 mantel candles, and the whole of the 7 months at Ravenmere, and the 2 days in the carriage north, and the 90 feet of the great dining table, and the small round table by the fire, and the folded fichu against a footman's hand, and the 200 miles between a Sunday in April and a Thursday in May, sat in the space between them and needed no crossing. He said, "At last there is a dance. The last waltz of the evening. It will begin in 10 minutes in the ballroom. I would like, if you would grant me the honor, to dance it with you." She said, "You have already danced the 7th with me." He said, "I have not, madam, danced them all." She stood. They went together down the stairs. The last waltz of the Ravenmere ball began at 1:30 in the morning. It was, by London convention of the year, the slowest waltz of the evening, the one at which the older ladies retired to the small drawing rooms and the servants began, quietly, to set out the supper. The candles in the ballroom had burned down by an inch. 2 of the chandeliers had been extinguished. The room, which at 10 had held 200, held perhaps 80. Julian led Elinor to the middle of the ballroom. They did not touch until the first bar of the music. When the first bar came, he placed his right hand at the small of her back and took her right hand in his left, and looked at her at the ordinary near distance a waltz requires, and did not look away. She looked back. They danced without speaking. Elinor had not danced a waltz since a country evening in Ashcombe 11 years before, and Julian, so far as she could tell, had not danced one in longer. Neither was particularly graceful. Neither cared. They danced at the slow pace the music kept, and Elinor felt, for the first time since her mother's death, that she was being held rather than steered, that the hand at the small of her back was not a hand telling her where to go, but a hand telling her that where she was allowed to be. At the second turn of the waltz he said quietly, "Madame Elinor, I have not asked since November one thing I ought to have asked. I ask it now. Will you, of your own free choice, and not by a bargain, and not by a debt, and not by a paper signed in the drawing-room of your father's house, will you be my wife?" She said quietly, "Julian, I have been your wife since November. I choose now to be it freely." He said, "That is what I hoped for." She said, "That is what I chose for." They danced for a bar or two without speaking, and Elinor thought, with a small clean surprise, that she had never in her life said the word chose about her own life aloud, and that saying it aloud had shifted, in a way she could not quite have named beforehand, the whole quiet arrangement of everything within her. She had been chosen at Ashcombe in October. She had been chosen at the wedding in November. She had been chosen at the fireside in December. She was, this evening, at the middle of a London ballroom, in a plain blue-gray silk that no one in the room had understood, doing the smaller and rarer thing. She was choosing. At the third turn of the waltz he lifted her hand, the one in his, a very little, and pressed his mouth once, briefly, to the back of her gloved fingers. It was not a courtly gesture. It was not for the ballroom. It was so small and so private that no one dancing beside them saw. Elinor felt it once, at the back of her hand, through the fine gray silk of her long glove, and it was the first time in her life that a man's touch had signified anything other than a formal handing at a door. She did not cry. She had, for 27 years, been in the habit of not crying where anyone could see. She did not now begin. But her eyes filled, once, quite briefly, and she did not look away from him, and he saw and understood, and did not remark upon it. He said, "At the last bar of the waltz, Elinor, will you come home to Ravenmere with me tomorrow?" She said, "Yes." The music ended. They stood a moment longer in the middle of the ballroom, at the near distance of the waltz, and then he offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked together toward the door of the ballroom. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenmere, in the largest armchair by the fire, watched them go. She did not smile. Her sharp black eyes were very slightly wet. She reached for her stick, and rose, and went in to supper without a word to anyone. The Countess of Lyford, at the door of the ballroom, as Elinor and Julian passed her, said only, quite quietly, "Tuesday at 11. I do not take milk." Elinor curtsied to her, small and exact. They went upstairs. At the door of Elinor's room, at the end of the long dim first-floor corridor, Julian stopped. He said, "Madame Elinor, I will not ask. I have not asked in 7 months, and I would rather ask on the 50th year than the 7th month. Only I should like to say good night to you, if you will let me." She said, "Julian." She held out her hand. He took it in both of his. He did not kiss her mouth. He kissed, once, gently, the back of the hand he had held on the waltz, and this time it was not through a glove. She had drawn her glove off in the corridor. It was, for both of them, the first time in 7 months that any bare hand had touched any bare hand. She said, "Good night, Julian." He said, "Good night, my wife." She went into her room. He stood a long moment at her door after it had closed, his hand on the doorframe, and then he went to his own room at the far end of the corridor and slept, for the first time in 8 years in the London house, without turning a signet ring even once on his little finger. The next morning they went home to Ravenmere. 1 year and 4 months later, on a September afternoon at Ravenmere Hall, the last of the summer light lay in a long warm bar across the flagstones of the great hall, and Mrs. Beak, standing at the foot of the stairs in her plain black wool housekeeper's dress with her white starched fichu at her throat and her keys at her waist, watched a small procession of 3 come down the wide oak staircase and smiled, once, quite privately, at the door of the servants' passage where no one could see. The Duchess of Ravenmere came down the stairs first. She was, that afternoon, in a plain long-sleeved dove-gray day gown with a high modest neckline and a cream fichu at the throat, and no jewel but the small dark oval mourning brooch. She was 27 still, in the ordinary count, and 28 by her own reckoning, and her chestnut-brown hair was in the same low chignon parted centrally that Mrs. Beak had first seen at the wedding at Ashcombe 15 months before. She looked, if one had to say it in a word, the same. If one looked longer, she did not. Behind her, at the 3rd step from the top, the Duke of Ravenmere came down carrying, very carefully, an 8-week-old infant in a plain white long gown and a plain white cap. The infant, a girl, had her mother's chestnut hair, faintly at the crown, and her father's gray eyes, faintly at the temple, and she was, by every account of the household, an infant who did not cry unless there was a reason. Her name was Anne. She had been named for both of the grandmothers she would never meet. Behind Julian, at the top of the stairs, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmere, 72 now, small and neat and sharper than ever, came down at her own unhurried pace, one hand on the banister, one hand on the stick. They went, all 3, out into the garden. The garden at Ravenmere had not been the same garden for a year and a half. The head gardener had, at Elinor's suggestion, opened the long box hedge along the eastern walk into a single broader path along which 2 might walk abreast. He had planted, on the Duchess's request, along the length of it, a hedge of small white winter chrysanthemums. He had made, at the far end of the walk, a small round bench of gray oak, beneath a young elm that the Duchess had asked to be brought as a sapling from Ashcombe. The elm was doing well. Sir Henry Ashcombe had died at Ashcombe in the previous March. Elinor had gone down for the funeral in her plain black wool traveling cloak, and had come home to Ravenmere on the 2nd day, and had, in the quiet way she did such things, wept once in her husband's arms on the 2nd night after her return, and had not wept for her father again, because Sir Henry had died knowing his daughter had been chosen, and knowing his debts had been paid, and knowing the annuity his son-in-law had settled on him, had carried him softly through his last winter. It had been, as far as the deaths of tired old men in tired small manors ever were, a kind death. Elinor was grateful for it. She thanked her husband, quietly every Sunday, for as long as she lived, for the softness of her father's last winter. Charlotte, in Kent, had written on hearing of Anne's birth a letter of such unaffected joy that Elinor had, unusually, kept it. Charlotte was to visit at Christmas with the curate and the green ribbon, and the small nephew Elinor had not yet met. The Marburys did not visit Ravenmere. Lady Catherine had, in the autumn of the year of the ball, married a very sensible baronet from Devon of 38 who did not attend London seasons, and had gone to Devon, and had, in a piece of information the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmere had once, at Bath, delivered to Elinor with a very small and very dry satisfaction, turned out, in Devon, to be a rather good and rather kind wife. Elinor had received this news with the equanimity she received most news. She had said quietly, "I am glad." She had meant it. Mrs. Beak, now 63, ran the household still. The small round mahogany table sat, permanently, at the fireside end of the great dining room, and the long dining table for 20 had been, at Elinor's suggestion, moved to the great drawing room, uncovered, and used for the household accounts, at which Elinor sat every Thursday morning with Mrs. Beak and the steward, and reviewed every rent, and every ledger, and every tenant, and every child of every tenant who had been ill in the past week. The Duchess of Ravenmere was known, at that Thursday hour, to be unavailable to callers. She was known, further, in the country round Ravenmere, as the Duchess who came to the tenants' cottages when the children were ill, and who read prayers in the parish church on Wednesdays when the vicar was too tired to come. She was not celebrated. She was not remarked upon. When she came at any tenant's door, the door opened without a knock, and the tenant said, always, "Come in, your grace," in a voice that was the same voice with which they had spoken to the last of their own mothers. The tenants' children called her, among themselves, the Grey Duchess. Elinor did not know this. It was one of the small facts of her life that would never be told to her, and that would remain, therefore, true. Ravenmere itself had softened by inches, over the year and 4 months, in ways that had nothing to do with paint or new furniture. The great drawing room downstairs, which had been dust-sheeted for 7 years, had been opened by degrees. A single sheet lifted in April, another in June, a third in August, and had, by the September of Anne's second month, become the room in which Elinor sat every evening after the household accounts, reading a book by the fire in the plain dove-gray day gown while Julian read at the small writing desk by the window. There were 2 chairs at the fire. There was a small round table between them. There was, on the table, a plain silver bowl into which each of them, in the course of a week, dropped small ordinary things they meant to speak of to the other and had forgotten. A page torn from an almanac, a pressed leaf from the Eastern Walk, a small copper coin one of the tenant's children had pressed into Elinor's hand on a Wednesday, a folded page from a book that Julian had marked to read to her aloud. Every Sunday evening they emptied the bowl together and spoke through what was in it, in front of the fire. On the afternoon of that September day, the Duke and the Duchess and the infant and the Dowager sat, all 4, on the small round gray oak bench beneath the young elm at the end of the Eastern Walk. Julian held the infant. Elinor held Julian's free hand. This she had begun to do, without particular remark, some months before, and Julian had never once made a remark of it. The Dowager sat at Elinor's other side, one hand on her stick, and looked, in her sharp, black-eyed way, at the young elm. She said, "At length, Elinor, it is an Ashcombe elm." Elinor said, "Yes." The Dowager said, "You have planted an Ashcombe at Ravenmere." Elinor said, "I have." The Dowager said, "And Ravenmere at Ashcombe, I hear." Elinor smiled very faintly. She said, "My father's grave. The elm at the head of the churchyard died in the winter. My husband arranged that a Ravenmere elm be sent down. It is planted. It is doing well." The Dowager said, "Good." They sat a while in the September light. Julian at length said quietly, to the infant on his knee, "And, my dear, this is your mother's country. You will know it in time. There is a village called Ashcombe, and there is a small church at the end of the village, and there is, at the back of that church, a pew nearest the door. Your mother sat in that pew for many years. She was, then, a woman no one in the county remembered to see. She was, in that pew, doing quiet, ordinary things. Mending a sleeve, reading a book, holding an old sexton's hand at a bad Wednesday service. Nobody saw her. That is not quite true. One person saw her. Your father saw her. He saw her on a Sunday in April, from the back of that same church, and he came home to Ravenmere and did not, for a season, know what to do with what he had seen. He decided, in the end, to do the only decent thing. He came back for her. You will be told, in your life, my end, that women are seen for their beauty, or for their fortunes, or for their names, or for the finery they wear at balls. You will be told these things by people whose eyes have never learned the harder work of seeing. Your mother was seen for none of them. Your mother was seen because she mended a tired man's sleeve at the back of a country church at Ashcombe on a Sunday in April, when she thought no one at all was looking. That is the whole of what a life is for, to be that person, and to be seen by someone who will not look away. He turned to Elinor. He said, "You were seen, Elinor, even when you thought you were invisible. And you will be seen, my love, for the whole of your life." Elinor said quietly, "Julian, that is the whole of what I hoped." She looked, once, at the young Ashcombe elm at the end of the Eastern Walk. She touched the small dark oval mourning brooch at her throat, once absently. The same small habitual gesture Julian had watched, at the back of a country church at Ashcombe on a Sunday in April, a lifetime ago. He watched her touch it now as he had watched her touch it then. He did not look away. The wind came up, once, faintly, along the Eastern Walk, and moved the small white winter chrysanthemums along the length of the hedge, and moved the leaves of the young Ashcombe elm at the end of it. And the afternoon light shifted a quarter turn along the flagstones of the terrace, and it was, for that moment, the whole of a life kept. And, on Julian's knee, made a small, unremarkable sound of the kind 8-week-old infants make when they are neither hungry nor cold nor troubled, and Julian, without looking, turned his hand and closed his fingers, once, gently, around one of the infant's very small hands. Elinor watched him do it. She did not remark upon it. She had, in a year and 4 months of marriage, learned that the smallest gestures were the ones that mattered, and that a woman who remarked upon them made them a little less true. She simply, in her turn, closed her fingers a little more surely around his other hand, and looked once at the young Ashcombe elm at the end of the eastern walk and was content. If you loved this story, our next tale will take you south to a rain-swept country parsonage where a marquis arrives one October afternoon in a plain coachman's coat and asks for the vicar's eldest daughter by name, and no one in the village, not even the young woman herself, will guess who he really is until the ballroom of Selby Hall is lit for the winter assembly. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.